Welcome to the Neurodiversity and Higher Education podcast. My name is Ryan Palm, and I am the Executive Director of the Brad McGarry Center for Neurodiversity at Mercyhurst University in Erie, Pennsylvania. I'm joined by some amazing students from our program who are helping with the behind-the-scenes element of this production. This podcast aims to be a resource for those who are interested in the intersection between neurodiversity and higher education. Whether you are a prospective student, family member, or someone working within the sector, we are glad you're here. Over the coming months, we will bring on a variety of thought leaders on topics relating to neurodiversity and higher education, with a particular emphasis on the transition into higher education and the transition from higher education into the workforce. We very much welcome your feedback on suggested topics, speakers, or thoughts on our episodes. We can be reached via email, neurodiversity@mercyhurst.edu, or feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We'll also put information on how to connect in our show notes for each episode. Today, we welcome Matt Gunter to the podcast. Matt became interested in the topic of neurodivergent college student readiness while exploring college options with his son. Matt collaborated with the College Autism Network, or CAN, to create 2 workbooks for neurodivergent high school and college students and their families. In 2024, he published College Readiness for Neurodivergent College Students. In February 2026, Matt and CAN released a second workbook entitled Manager to Consultant, Parenting Your Neurodivergent College Student. Matt hosts Inclusive Academia, a YouTube channel for neurodivergent high school students and their families who are exploring their educational and career options. Matt's also developing a mobile application called Routine Success that supports executive functioning and independent living skills. Matt can be reached at matt.gunter@routine-success.com. Thanks so much, Matt, for joining us on the podcast. Thanks so much, Matt, for joining us on the Neurodiversity and Higher Education podcast. Really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ryan. Great to join you today.
So I think we have so many things in common, a lot of different directions we could go with our conversation, and I think we both joked about not wanting to make it a 5-hour episode. So I'm gonna try to stick to the script and not get distracted by too many things. But I wondered if you'd start by telling us a little bit about your background and kind of how you ended up being so interested in this topic.
Sure, happy to. And again, great to be here. So I'm a dad of a neurodivergent college student named Peter. He is doing great. He's a sophomore at the University of Arkansas right now, and he's part of the autism support program there run by Dr. Eliza Green, and it has really been a great fit for him. I became really interested in this topic through my son and our experience, really when he was a sophomore in high school is when we began to think about colleges and began to explore what was out there for him. I think in Peter's case, he knew he wanted to go, hopefully, to a bigger school because he loves nothing more than college sports. So he personally wanted that aspect of college. He also knew he wanted to study a STEM field. And so he was looking for a school that offered computer science, data science, engineering, those types of offerings. But he went to a great high school, had a wonderful experience there. But when we went and talked to his counselors, it was pretty obvious that this was a bit of a unique situation for them in terms of helping him create a list and think about schools. We're blessed in that Peter is very gifted academically, lots of cognitive ability. But he was looking for some support for executive functioning and some of those other types of challenges. And luckily, we stumbled upon the College Autism Network. I know Mercyhurst is part of the College Autism Network. I'd highly recommend that to families in terms of this is a great searchable tool to help you find programs that are out there that can support students. And but as we got into it, what we found is, and you know this, Ryan, the programs can be very different from one another, different points of emphasis. Some are free, other ones, I'd say the majority of them, there's an additional service fee or fee associated with those above tuition, room, and board. Some, in Peter's case, they really help channel him into housing with other students in the program. Others are less involved in that area. And I think there's a tremendous difference in terms of the areas of focus in terms of support. Some don't really get involved in social connections at all, and others, that's a major emphasis for the program. Academics, some of them take more of a direct approach, and others, they have more of a partnership with the tutors and the writing center on campus and help facilitate that. So that's where I felt like I could potentially help some other families that are at that stage of exploring college to really get a little bit more of a behind-the-scenes look of some of the programs that are out there, and I almost have that be that initial information interview, if you will, with the director of programs like yours.
That's fantastic. There's so many elements of your explanation there that I think we'll cover today. But I think it's just really to set from the outset that you come from this in a very authentic, intentional way because you've lived it. And oftentimes I think there's no better way to tell somebody about a topic than having shared your own lived experience. And I'm grateful for all the time and effort you put into sharing that experience with so many. And I think I've said this on many episodes of this podcast that we routinely encounter families who have no idea that these opportunities exist and they don't know where to start. And your resources we'll talk about today, I think, are just a wonderful place for so many families to maybe start, maybe spend a lot of time, and maybe end up finishing based on what they find with you. So one of my favorite things you do is the Inclusive Academia series on YouTube. I've had the honor to be a guest as part of that series and really enjoyed the chance to do that. But I'd love if you share a little bit about the series in general to make sure people know about it, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But what are some maybe big picture takeaways you have from that effort so far? I think you're over 75 videos at this point, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's right. And it was great to have the tables turned and have you on as a guest, Ryan. So thank you for coming on. It is a YouTube channel that is out there. As I said, I felt like there was a way for me to kind of pay forward and share some of what we had learned with other families that are out there. So for the most part, what the YouTube channel does is provide, as I said, those kind of one-on-one profiles of autism and neurodivergent support programs that are out there. But then we do also dive into some special topics like particularly college readiness. I would say overarching themes that I would share. First of all, although we're making great progress as a country, I still wish there were more programs like yours out there. And I think, if you went back 20, 25 years, they basically didn't exist. So we feel very blessed as a family that we've made the progress as a country as we have. But I also think there's generally low awareness among many families. We talk all the time about the program Peter's in, and the general response is, I didn't know something like that existed. So we're really trying to increase the awareness of autism and neurodiversity support programs that are out there, because they are such a great asset. I already kind of touched on, I think there can be very subtle but important differences in the focus areas for programs, which is why I think Inclusive Academia is potentially a good place for some families to start, to get an idea of, watch them together and get an idea of what sounds attractive and which types of supports are potentially most important to your student. The devil really is in the details in that regards. And it's also, I would just say, it is really how I became personally interested in the topic of college readiness. Lee Burdett Williams, who runs the College Autism Network, I know you know Lee, Ryan, I believe she was on an earlier episode. Wonderful lady. She's very passionate about the topic of college readiness because it is such a high stakes transition for families and for students, not just financially, the fact that if it doesn't work out, it could be tens of thousands of dollars, but it also can be kind of an emotional and mental health setback for students if they don't pick the right place for them, and then they ultimately need to withdraw or take a step back. And so we really dove in there, and that has led to some other projects that we have done with the College Autism Network, most notably these couple of workbooks that we have published together.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think there's so much there that's valuable on the YouTube page. And just as you can on the CAN website, which I've talked about, I think every episode, there's, the database of schools that you can see, and there's other resources out there outside of those two places, but to be able to see the depth and the breadth of programs that are available, that you have a much larger school like Arkansas versus a smaller place like Mercyhurst, and there's certainly some that are even smaller yet. It's just important for families to know there's a lot of options out there for them. And the second thing you touched on that I just so strongly believe is really important part of the conversation is that college readiness piece. And more programs are trying to start that process earlier with families. Here at Mercyhurst, we have 2 different summer programs, and now we're doing dual enrollment, all aimed around providing that college readiness support. And that may be, actual true skill building, but sometimes it's also confidence building. If you can feel like I can go to a college campus, make some friends, or I can take a college course and I know I can, kind of get my way through a college level history course, then you have, one more, feather in your cap that hopefully will help you succeed on a college campus. And in that transition, which is, I very frequently say that transition is stressful for all college students, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum. But it certainly can be a little more anxiety provoking for our neurodivergent friends. And we want to try and continue supporting that as much as we can. Well, I think, you've observed a lot. You've talked to a lot of people, maybe as many as anybody in our field, so to speak, if you will. I'd be curious if you could offer some takes on what do you think most colleges still misunderstand about neurodivergent learners?
Well, as I already indicated, I wish there were more programs like Mercyhurst and Arkansas that are out there. We are fortunate that we live in a time in which more programs get added every year. But I still think that the majority of the schools out there are potentially missing an opportunity to attract more neurodivergent students. As I'm sure you know all too well, Ryan, most colleges in the United States are facing enrollment challenges these days as we begin to see kind of a shift out of the bigger classes that have recently matriculated to some smaller ones, and we've recently seen some smaller colleges go under. There's a small Catholic college in Toledo, Ohio, near where I grew up, that recently just announced that they're closing. So attracting new students and retaining those students has never been more critical. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a huge investment by programs to get it started. College Autism Network has, I believe a program that gives you kind of a blueprint to consider and start a program on your campus. Most of these programs are economically self-sustaining, either by charging families, and then there are ways to defer the cost for families through programs like vocational rehab in some cases. And neurodivergent students like my son just have so much potential. But what we tend to see, unfortunately, is a very high dropout rate. Some studies say as high as a 60% dropout rate for autistic students that matriculate to college, and then far too high of an unemployment rate amongst neurodivergent students. So in some cases, they just need a little extra scaffolding, particularly around areas like executive functioning. And I wish that more programs would consider adding great programs like you have at Mercyhurst.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I think you're spot on with. There are programs like the one we have at Mercyhurst and many of our peers that are large and have multiple staff and even a physical space on campus and all these bells and whistles, so to speak. But that's step 10 of a 10-step process, right? Getting to have more universities embracing steps 1 through 4, I think would be just a massive gain for all of us in higher education and for humanity for sure. But
that's right.
It's important work. And I think, we see, if you look at the statistics in all ways, looking at it in terms of the diagnoses of young people across the neurodivergent spectrum, we know we're going to have more students coming to college who self-identify as being neurodivergent. And we might as well, start sooner rather than later being equipped to help support that population to achieve what they're so capable of. And you see it firsthand in your own family, and we see it each and every day with the students we get to work with, that there is so much potential in this group of students, and they don't need mountains of support, right? They need little bits here and there, and those little bits go a tremendously long way to helping them. So I really appreciate that. So you mentioned it earlier, you've now taken part in creating a couple books that I think are really instrumental and helpful for this community, whether that's folks who are working in programs like ours or for parents that are going through this journey. And I really appreciate your most recent book, which really helps focus on this idea of transition for parents or for family members, knowing that oftentimes students have grandparents or aunts or uncles or caregivers that are helping them along this journey. And they often end up acting as a manager for their student, almost like an agent for a college athlete, and that they're doing a lot of the interviewing of the programs, they're doing the research, they're doing the talking, and sometimes students are heavily engaged, and other times it's a pretty one-sided conversation with the families. And then they get to the point where the student goes to college and they essentially have to sort of back off and be hands off because, that's one of the big things we talk about with families we meet with. But one of the biggest things they have to be aware of is that they go from a highly supported, structured environment in high school where that family member is incredibly involved to the inverse of that at the college level. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you pay the bill maybe, but that's about it, right? That's the primary, role of your involvement. Everything else falls on the student in most instances. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about the book, why you thought it was important to work on that, and maybe some highlights from it.
Sure, thank you, Ryan. And the name of the book, as you touched on, is Manager to Consultant: Parenting Your Neurodivergent College Student, and it was really designed to be a practical, hands-on workbook done in collaboration again with the great people at the College Autism Network. And the catalyst for it was really one of your peer program directors who said that he's worked with literally at this point hundreds of families over the years, and that not surprisingly parents and families and support networks can really make the difference because every student, be they neurodivergent or neurotypical, is going to probably encounter some bumps along the way. And mom and dad and the rest of the social network can really make the difference between whether that turns around and becomes a productive learning experience or can kind of spiral from there and become more of a catalyst for additional problems. So as part of this work, we set out and we conducted 2 surveys. The first was with parents of current and recent neurodivergent college students. The second was with autism program directors like yourself. And what we heard, first of all, from our parents, they freely admitted that the overwhelming majority of them were very hands-on with their students during high school. And as you touched on, kind of all aspects, academically, but also in many cases, life skills, doing the laundry, waking their students up, in some cases socially, helping give them a bit of a prod to be more engaged socially. But surprisingly, only about 35% of them said that they thought that their approach was highly effective. And nearly a quarter of them, on the other hand, on the other extreme, said that it really wasn't effective at all. And then we also talked to parents and heard from a lot of them that they had a really hard time letting go when their students went to college. As you said, the transition's tough for any family when a kid goes away to college. It can be particularly difficult for our neurodivergent students and for the parents who have been very hands-on and very involved to accept a different role when their student goes away. And only about 40% of our parents said that they made an intentional decision to try to let go and pull back a little bit when their student went away. Now, the majority of the rest said ultimately they got there, but in many cases it was kind of forced upon them, if you will, by the situation of geographical distance, the very different legal environment where in many cases schools won't engage with mom and dad, or in some cases push back from the students themselves who said, hey, I'm in college now, mom, dad, you need to take a step back. I want to try to do this on myself. So, I think one of the most shocking little factoids that we heard was that 40% of the parents that we surveyed said that they communicate with their college students at least one time per day while they're at college. And we had one respondent who indicated that they talk to their student more than 25 times per week. So again, I think what was very clear is that the struggle can be real to try to let go a little bit. Our directors really, when we talked to them, indicated again that parents can really be the difference makers, for better or for worse, when things get a little bit tough. And what they said is they had encountered examples where parents kind of are two hands off, if you will. So there's a bit of an expectation of, hey, I'm paying good money for this program. You've got my student now, and best of luck. But that was much less noted. Literally 97% of our program directors that we talked to said that they have experienced parents that are still too involved, and that's really kind of the theme of manager to consultant. We literally had more than 50% of them say that they've encountered times where they felt that parents were working against them, providing contradictory advice, telling their students to ignore the coaching that they're receiving there on campus. So those are kind of like the foundational things that I would highlight in terms of it can be very, very difficult, as we said, to change your mind frame when any student goes away to college, but I think particularly difficult for parents of neurodivergent students in some cases.
Thanks so much for that detailed explanation. And I just can't highly recommend, the book enough. I think it's the right tone, and the practical nature of it is really good. And we in our program have so many conversations with families and the students, but especially the families, about the transition, about what that means. And, certainly within the top 5 of the most commonly asked questions that I get is, how often do you communicate with parents, right? And there's no straightforward answer there, right? Like we have our standards that we follow, but we're not monsters. We're not going to, ignore you if something's going wrong. And yet we don't want you calling us every day to check in and see how little Jimmy or Julie's doing, right? So it's such a challenge. And I think what the book can do, and many of the resources you provide, is provide families an opportunity to think through where they are in their journey. And then ideally be a little bit prepared for that when that time comes. Or if it is already upon them, how can they help support their student? Because the more you are able to sort of step back from your role and almost, like that imaginary thing where you're looking at it above, thinking what is your student doing and how are you interacting with their role? I think there's so much value to that, to say, I know they want to help. I know they want to be supportive, but they may not even realize the way in which they may be, unintentionally sabotaging the progress that their student could make. I think if there's a common element to many of the support programs like ours at Mercyhurst, we want to help foster those key independence and self-sufficiency skills.
Right.
And we're going to do a lot to give them a little bit of, opportunity to kind of walk the plank and figure things out. But if the family's there, immediately taking away that independence, that can be counterproductive and doesn't help achieve some of those goals. And nobody wants failure. But, you learn a lot from failure and getting close to failure. And we think students often need to experience that as part of this process. So it's this balance between, right? And I think the next thing I wanted to ask you to talk about is this idea of how can a family, successfully gradually step back rather than dropping their child off and say, we'll see you in December. Let me know how it goes, right? There's a big difference between those two things. And so, what advice would you have based on, kind of all the time you spent working on this book?
Yeah, I mean, we, as you said, we lived through it. It can be really, really challenging at times to see your student struggle. And but that was really a theme that came through from our director respondents, is that if you want your student to continue to grow, and ultimately the goal, I think, for the majority of families is not just to see their student walk across the stage and get a diploma, but it's for them to have a happy, productive college experience where they build skills beyond just the technical skills that they're learning in the classroom and that degree, so that they're set up for success and as much autonomy and independence as they can have after college as well. So it's really critical to, as parents, although highly uncomfortable at times, to embrace that concept of productive failure. We're kind of going through that right now. My son is going to go study in Italy for a month or so this summer, which he's very excited for and we're very excited for. But it's a little scary as well, but we feel he's earned the right and we're going to try to support him in doing that. And then, I think there were really kind of 5, I think, universal themes that came through from the program directors, Ryan. So, the first one is presenting a unified front. So first of all, if you accept the help of an autism support program or the Disability Services Office, let's make sure that we are aligned and not, rowing in a different direction in terms of advice. And trust the process. I think the first thing, if a student calls and they're struggling with, a great question per program directors like you is that you should probably say, well, what have you tried already, and who have you talked to there on campus, and try to avoid that urge to jump in and fix it for them. Secondly, I called this "no news is good news." So as you said, you cared passionately for the students you support, I'm sure, and if you are very concerned about them, I'm certain you reach out and speak to the families about it. But families really need to try to resist the urge, I think, to call you every day about, Johnny missed a class today. A lot of college students miss classes, and I think you shouldn't hesitate to reach out if you have serious concerns about your student. But if you're not hearing much from the director of the program that your student is in many cases, no news is good news, and you should be happy about that.
Yeah.
So thirdly, then they talked about triad meetings. So the concept of, if the student is struggling, first of all, I would guess you follow a similar philosophy, but you're not real comfortable talking directly with the parent about the student without the student being aware and involved in that conversation. So they try to arrange 3-way meetings that involve the student, really placing the student at the center of that conversation. And it creates an atmosphere of accountability where the student feels that they have ownership for their own life and it's not being decided for them. And then also probably reduces some of the anxiety that, mom and dad are telling me one thing and Ryan's telling me something different. And then, a little bit quicker, but the last 2 were around providing strategic external support resources if asked, right? So in some cases, a program director may reach out and say, hey, your student could use some additional counseling, or I think it'd be a good idea to have their meds checked out, et cetera. Parents can play a very valuable role in that regards. And then lastly, I think they said and this can be difficult at times as well, but it's really important for parents to manage their own mental health through this whole thing. It's kind of like the old airline adage of, you need to put your own oxygen mask on before you can help your student by putting their oxygen mask on. So it's really important you manage your own mental health and anxiety through all this.
Yeah, those are really good. I appreciate you running through those. They're all valuable pillars, I think, and so much of it harkens back to the search process, right? And so, when you know some of those key topics, it might help you as a family best ask the questions of the support programs you're considering, right? Most of the families that come our way are looking at a couple different schools and a couple different support programs. And as we discussed earlier, they're different in what they do and what they don't do. And so I think if you can spend a little time as a family thinking about what are some of those like non-negotiables for your situation, or what do you really truly care about, and be able to have those conversations with program directors up front, it's going to save you a lot of headache, hassle, and stress potentially, once your student is there and going through those motions. I think I can speak for a lot of my colleagues across the board. We want to make sure that families and students know what they're getting into and what they're not getting into, so that we create the best possible environment for success, right? The last thing we want is a student to arrive on one of our campuses and realize they thought they were going to get access to XYZ, but we don't do that. And therefore they get sent into a panic and a spiral and end up, leaving halfway through the semester. That's worst case in so many different levels. And so, I'm constantly telling families when we meet with them, I met with 2 of them today, right? If you have questions, please just ask. Like, we truly are happy to help, answer your questions and provide whatever we can. because we know it's a big decision and we know it's important. And the more you do that up front, in our experience, the better the result is going to be. And it's a lot of work and it's overwhelming, and you often don't know where to start. And that's why resources like you've assembled are so helpful for so many. So again, I'm grateful for that. So we've talked about it a little bit. I'm maybe dancing around the place here, but college readiness is, again, something we come back to repeatedly, and how does a family help prepare their student to be college ready and what that looks like. And there's books and podcasts and journal articles and the like on that. But I'd be curious, your take working with, your own student and all the folks you've talked to, how would you define college readiness, and in particular, maybe beyond the grade point average and the test scores?
Right. Yeah, such an important question. So that was really the focus of a workbook that we did with the College Autism Network in 2024 called College Readiness for Neurodivergent Students. And in that, again, we went and talked to very experienced directors like yourself, Ryan, and really gathered their perspective. And we polled the audience on 10 critical skill areas, and those are things like executive functioning and independent living skills and mental health and social connections. So things that could be strengths or development areas for neurodivergent students, and really try to get their perspective on which of those were the most important. The first thing I think we learned is that they were deemed to some degree all very important, and there's the more of those that are strengths, probably the easier the student is going to have in terms of their transition to college. I think the lowest score that we had was 7 out of 10 on a 1 to 10 scale. So they were all very important to some degree, but there really were 2 that jumped to the top, and those aren't necessarily even skills. They're more, I would say, inherent to the student. The first one was motivation. Does the student really want to be at college? Do they know why they want to go to college beyond it's the next thing to do, or my mom and dad expect that I'm going to go to college, or the counselor at school said, hey, I should go give it a try? Can they articulate to some degree why they want to go to college? And then the other side of the coin is a willingness to seek and accept help, because as we've said already, roadblocks are almost inevitable for any college student, neurotypical or neurodivergent. They are going to stumble at times, and is your student willing to accept that help? We had program directors who say people are spending thousands of dollars in some cases to pay for this extra support for their students, but then the students don't really want that. They're not willing to listen to it. So that's really, really important. And I think I would guess that when you do fit interviews with your students, those are a couple of the things that you're really looking for. Does the student really want to be there? Not just mom and dad want them to be there. And then, how coachable are they? Do they want the help of your program? And I think the general sentiment of our directors was, if they have those 2, we can provide an awful lot of support for the other 8. It's not that they're not important by any means, but without those 2, the job becomes very, very difficult, because the student doesn't really want to be there, and or they're not really embracing the help that's provided to them.
Yeah, that's extremely well said, and certainly something I talk about with most families I meet with. Sometimes I'm asked the question, sometimes students don't make it. Why is that, right? And it's very, very frequently that they just don't want to be there. And
right.
And so, in our program here at Mercyhurst, we do have, conversations with families as part of the application process. And we intentionally split the student and the family into separate conversations so that ideally we get the very honest take from that student. And if, autistic students are known for anything, it's often their honesty, right? And so we know that student's going to tell us whether they actually want to go to college or not. And if they say, no, my mom is making me do this, that's a very telling sign, right? And that leads to a different conversation that we're going to have. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And, it's not going to often put that student in a position for success in that scenario. And they often may not be ready that moment, right? Maybe they need a break. Maybe they need a gap year. Maybe they need 1 or 2 classes at a community college before they go into a 4-year setting. There's lots of ways in which that doesn't mean it's the end of a journey into higher education, but forcing it tends to be a very challenging situation and something that, in our experience at least, does not often end well. But it happens. And the willingness to take the support is huge. And that kind of goes into what I was going to ask you about next, which is, some of the readiness gaps that we see. And I think, self-advocacy is one of those that comes up all the time with our team and our students, and their willingness to self-advocate for lots of ways. But one of those ways is, I need help, and I want to ask somebody how to get that help.
Right.
In what I would call comprehensive support programs, where we meet with the student once a week and we get to know them really well, we can sense when something's not going right, and we're often quick to jump in and make a suggestion. It seems you've been really sad lately, or it seems, for whatever reason, you've taken a dip in your studies. What's going on? But we want students to be able to self-advocate for themselves before we have to say that to them, or in the circumstances where we're not there to notice that. And that those are skills that I think not only are important in the college readiness piece, but they're also going to be incredibly essential post-college in that transition. And so, is that a gap that you've seen a lot in kind of the conversations you've had with program directors and families?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, willingness to seek and accept help, as I said, is kind of the baseline, right? Where if you're in one of these programs, you're going to show up and you're going to have your coaching every week. Are you going to really participate that and work with your coach and try to implement some of those strategies that you develop together? I'd say the higher level skill, though, would be students who are comfortable in terms of helping to advocate for themselves, and as you said, ask for help when needed. So that really came out in our surveys as being an important skill. Beyond that, I think there were a handful of others that I would highlight in terms of readiness gap. Executive functioning, very, very high on our list, particularly in this most recent survey that we did for the manager to consultant book. That was the number one concern for parents. It was not necessarily, as you said, the GPA and the academics. It was the fact that college is a much less structured environment than high school. High school, you're getting up, you're getting dropped off at 7:30 or 8 o'clock. You're getting picked up at 3, 4 o'clock, and you come home with homework that's due the next day. College, very different environment. Mom and dad aren't there. It's much easier for students to get lost in video games and forget about the fact that they need to be working on that multi-week assignment now, not the night before it's due. So executive functioning, very high. Self-regulation, so the ability to stay in a relatively regulated state and recognize those stressors when they're building and have some self-soothing techniques. To maybe a bit less degree, but independent living skills also scored high. Particularly, I would say, like the hygiene side of things, sleep habits, managing your living space, living with a roommate potentially. Those absolutely were mentioned. And then, academic skills are very important. I think that it differs from student to student. I think what we heard from the directors in our survey is that you should make sure that your student has taken a rigorous college prep course load, because, as you know, Ryan, colleges are not going to be willing to modify curriculum. They will make accommodations, but they're not going to modify curriculum. So in that regards, I think it's important that your students take a rigorous course of study in high school to make sure they are academically prepared for what's coming. And then lastly, mental health, and that can be difficult for any student in college, particularly neurodivergent students, and I'd say especially if they are socially isolated in any way. When they do run into those inevitable roadblocks, we have students that unfortunately they struggle from a mental health standpoint, and that can really spiral.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the mental health piece is certainly, amongst the program director community, if you will, it is always, one of the top topics that we're discussing. And I think so much of the support structure that we've talked about in our time today and that just exists really is to help the day-to-day, but it's really to build the foundation so that when something goes wrong, it doesn't immediately come crashing down, because for any college student on our campus and any campus, you're going to have bad days, weeks. You're going to do surprisingly bad on a test. You're going to, things are going to happen. That's just the way of college, right? And to be able to bounce back from that and, keep going and know that you have resources available and that you've built the friendships, or you've built you've had some familiarity with the counseling center, or there's just all those little things add up in such a big way to have the outlet to not spiral down to a place that's not recoverable. And I think it's hard to kind of explain that to a family, who's thinking about this transition, that baseline is really important to build up, right? Like I often try to think of a good analogy, but like if you have this, this extra support layer there, that when you fall a little bit, the support will be there to pick you up and keep you going.
Yeah, it's so important. Agreed.
So we're starting to wrap up here. Just a couple of quick ones, maybe. When you think about the recent book, in the previous book, you've talked about them both, and we'll link to them in the show notes. They're so great. What might you want to share with a higher ed professional who either supports neurodivergent students in a program like ours, or many of the others we talked about, or just that maybe works, in a university setting and has a lot of neurodivergent students? What advice might you share with them?
Yeah, so, I think first and foremost, we've touched on it a number of times. I just would love to see more programs like what you run there at Mercyhurst, Ryan. I really feel like the autism support program professionals that we talk to in these surveys, they're truly the gold standard in terms of providing support to neurodivergent students. Incredibly knowledgeable, compassionate, very experienced. I think a lot of the folks like yourself, they've spent their entire career in this space. But unfortunately, there are only a couple of hundred colleges out there that have programs as robust as yours. As you said, comprehensive support programs out of 4,000 or so accredited colleges in the U.S. So hopefully we continue to see that grow. I think that for those parents that are out there, I think you really need to be thoughtful about how much and what type of support your student needs and what will allow them to thrive when they get to college. And I think it's really important that you go in and ask the right questions, particularly if your student is considering a school that does not have a program like Mercyhurst. Admissions folks are wonderful. I think they generally do want students to apply. And so if you ask them questions about, do you have neurodivergent students on campus? Do you offer accommodations? You'll likely hear a lot of the right things about having a great disability services and accessibility department, and that they can help with accommodations. But, some of our students, frankly, need a lot more than accommodations. And it's really important to consider their executive functioning skills, how academically prepared they are, as we just talked about. Where are they going to live? Will they be able to, do they need a single room, or can they live with a roommate? Do they want to live with a roommate? And so I think it's really important that, you come with a list of questions to think about. And, back to your original question, for the higher ed professionals, try to make that easy for families to find, because there are numerous examples of colleges where that's kind of buried on the 8th page of the newspaper. So trying to bring that forward and make it easy to find for families would be a piece of advice.
That's great. I appreciate that and echo all of that. So you can't be as involved in this world of, supporting neurodivergent students transitioning to higher education without hopefully having some thoughts about higher education in general. So, as somebody who is a nerd on the field in general, I'd like to ask you, what trends in higher ed maybe give you some hope or maybe give you some worry?
Well, I'll sound like a broken record, but I'm so thankful that my son is in college now versus 20, 25 years ago, because programs like the one that you have almost did not exist at that point. And so we're very fortunate to live in a time where I think there is greater awareness and greater appreciation of the skills and capabilities of neurodivergent students, and a growing understanding of the types of supports that can help them be successful. I think my worry on the other side is that, we take a step back and lose momentum. I hope that programs like this are not considered, DEI and all the implications of that acronym over the last few years, because we really need to continue to focus as a country on this area. It's really critical that we help these students prepare for and successfully transition to life beyond college. It's a tough job market for any entry-level student right now, and I think a lot of corporations still have a lot to learn in terms of how to interview, how to hire, and how to support neurodivergent associates. So those are a few of the things that keep me up at night, but I come back to the fact that we've made so much progress as a nation over the last 25 years, and again, just very thankful that we live in the time that we do, where my son gets the incredible support that he does at Arkansas.
Well, and I think it's a testament to people like yourselves who are, willing to say, here's what we learned and we want to help other people. And I think that's great. Maybe you're making a big giant pile of money off those book sales, but I think it's probably more so out of the goodness of your heart and passion for the industry. So kudos to you. So this podcast is largely geared towards families of neurodivergent students, but I know we have some neurodivergent students themselves that join along and listen. So if there's a neurodivergent high school senior out there listening and wondering to themselves, can I really do this? What would you have to say for them?
I would say that if you really want to go to college, and I would add to that, if you understand why you want to go to college, and if you are willing, as we talked about, to seek and accept help, because everybody is going to run into some bumps along the way, whether they're have a neurotypical brain or a brain that works different, everybody's going to run into those issues. So as we talked about earlier, if you really want to go and you're willing to ask for and accept help along the way, there's no doubt in my mind that you can do it. I would add, though, that you should soul search and discuss with your family that loves you so much and helps you decide. You don't necessarily have to go away to college right away. There's no federal law that says that if you graduate from college in May or June, or graduate from high school in May or June, that you need to go to college in August or September of the following fall. You already touched on this, Ryan. There are lots of other great options out there as well. Some students prefer to take a gap year, or some prefer to start at a community college where they can still live at home. So if you are really anxious, don't think that it needs to be a situation where you have got to go away to a 4-year residential college the fall after you graduate from high school.
That's well said. Thank you. So wrap it up. Where would you like to direct the listeners if they want to learn more about inclusive academia and the other resources we've talked about today?
Sure. Inclusive Academia you can find on YouTube. You should be able to find it if you do a search there. And then the workbooks that we referenced, you can go to www.college-ready.com, and there's a lot more information about how to get them there.
That's fantastic. Matt, I really appreciate your time today, and even more so all the time and energy that you and your family are putting into to helping others to find a path towards what might be best for their student as they think about the transition out of high school into whatever comes next. It's a daunting transition. It's full of a lot of anxiety and worry and fear and questions. And without a doubt, the resources that you're assembling are being very helpful for those families going through the process. So again, thanks for your time today, and thanks for all that you're doing.
Ryan, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Neurodiversity and Higher Education podcast. We are grateful for joining us. If you haven't already, please be sure to check out our past episodes, and we would appreciate if you can rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help it reach more people interested in this topic. We hope you'll subscribe if you haven't already. Tell a friend. Help us grow our reach. As always, thanks to Jack and Gia for their support on this episode. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. A friendly reminder to stay tuned for updates from the Brad McGarry Center for Neurodiversity by visiting mercyhurst.edu/neurodiversity or check our show notes for social media feeds. Until next time, Carpe Diem.